The question here about this CPI data, knowing it's softer than expected, is really whether it's showing finally the emergence of tariffs in inflationary data. The administration has told us that's never going to happen. What do you see when you look under the hood?
Well, I mean, it is inflation data that is lower than expected, but it's still higher than where the Fed wants it to be. And it's still high for families all across the country. When you look at some basics like, meat and eggs and other things that, people buy at the grocery store all the time, we have not seen the kind of relief that families need to see. And that is, of course, on top of the kinds of increases that families are facing in costs around healthcare that's likely to come or is already coming for families because of the cutbacks to the Affordable Care Act premiums. So the consequences for families remain pretty distressing, and you can see that in the consumer sentiment data and the like, where people are anxious about the economy right now. But it is certainly better than I guess economists expected, given the fact that we don't have a lot of data to look at right now because of the shutdown.
So to that point about this lack of data, and I made sort of the joke earlier with Joe that next week it would have been a jam-packed week when it comes to economic projections and what we do know about the current state of the economy. I'm wondering what you are watching, what you are looking for amid this lack of economic data, particularly as we're talking about economic growth, because as of now, it doesn't look like we're going to get third quarter GDP data. How is all of that factoring into what you perceive as the state of the U.S. economy?
Well, I think, we are flying blind right now. It's, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We don't have access to the kind of data that we need to understand the economy. We think that this is especially important right now because if the economy is at what economists would call an inflection point, if we're moving from, growth to maybe growth slowing or paring back, and these are, of course, the reasons that the Fed would lower interest rates next week to make sure that we don't see us move towards recession or don't see more job troubles in the labor market. Without access to that data, we don't know. We, of course, have all the other kinds of private sector data and other things that we can look at. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that we know as much as we would if we had this really important government data. And I want to stress, because I think that can kind of get lost in the details, that it is about helping us all understand what kinds of outcomes we're seeing across the country. Without that national data, we're left with anecdotes, we're left at the individual stories. But of course, we live in a country with, 340 million people? We can't know all of that unless we have access to this data. So it's important for families that we all understand what inflation is, what jobs are, so that policymakers can make sound decisions and so that we as citizens can hold them accountable.
Heather, you helped to run the White House Council of Economic Advisors, so you have been able to see behind the scenes the way this works, how the sausage is made in a way that most Americans never will. When we hear that the BLS has compiled jobs data, in this case, I guess this would go back to August or September now, but chose not to release that data because of the government shutdown, what would be involved in making that public? And do you think that should be a priority?
Well, I find it very concerning that they chose not to release it. One of the things that you always try to do if you're trying to run the government based on facts and evidence, because whether or not people are employed is a fact, right? And you want to gather those facts so you can make good policy decisions. It really has been striking the extent to which this administration has made it harder for the Federal Reserve to do its job and made it harder for the American people to hold it accountable. So in prior administrations, they were focused on making sure that the unemployment insurance data was still released on a timely basis. I think they could have made a different decision on the labor data that would have come out in early October. And I think that speaks to a lack of transparency, or does it speak to the fact that the data wasn't good and they didn't want us to know what it said? I mean, it leads to this sort of conspiracy thinking, which is not helpful when you're talking about an economy as important as the United States and with a data indicator so important to American families who get up and want to know, hey, should I be worried about keeping my job? Is the labor market good or bad? Giving people that information is really helpful for their kitchen table conversations, especially because all of the data we're seeing on, again, consumer confidence, consumer sentiment, says that people are anxious about the job situation right now. So it seems odd that they would have made that choice from my perspective, and it's very distressing that they did that. It was good, of course. I think that we saw the data come out today on prices, and I think that will help inform a better decision coming out of the Federal Reserve meeting next week.
And Heather, just more broadly speaking, what sort of economic impacts are you expecting when it comes to a longer-term government shutdown? We know, of course, that furloughed employees are going to be counted as temporarily unemployed. But when we get that labor market data and the government reopens, then that could have an impact on the unemployment rate. What are you just watching for here, as we really haven't gotten any signs that this is abating anytime soon?
I think we're looking for signs of economic distress. We're already seeing that the number of folks that are having trouble making their car payments is shot up. It's been going up, and that's as high as it was, back in 2009. So that's very disconcerting. If someone doesn't get a paycheck, even if they're likely to get that money back because of laws passed by Congress that say that furloughed workers will get their paychecks eventually, that can mean that they miss their mortgage or they miss paying other things. It's going to slow down the economy, and it's going to slow down the economy in particular places. And it's going to affect the decisions that people make. So I think we are looking for this stress and how that is playing its way out across the economy. But let's look at the other side of the equation. Of course, one of the reasons that we have this shutdown is because the Trump administration and the Republicans want to cut back on the amount of subsidies for people's health care premiums. This is a really big ticket budget item for millions of American families who are struggling to be able to afford the cost of health care. And the cutbacks that were already made as a part of the Republican budget bill, that one big beautiful bill that passed back in the spring, these are going to make the cost for healthcare more expensive around the country, and that's going to crowd out other kinds of spending. So I think for millions of families right now, they're looking at what can they cut back on, and that's never a good starting place for economic growth.